I think we have extremely poor odds of saving are games that are true subscriptions, where in other words, you pay like World of Warcraft or
Right.
Final Fantasy 14, where you pay money after 30 days or 6 months or whatever you pay for, that's it. Your access is up.
Mhm.
Well, that tends to meet the definition of a service in
Right. I
most
was going to bring
consumer.
up like software as a service and the relation with that. Like if you say, for example, you are paying for Adobe Creative Cloud, and then let's say Adobe goes out of business tomorrow, right? Or you
Yeah.
stop paying for your Creative Cloud. Like there's definitely some similarities there with the MMO model.
Yeah, and I'm not a fan of that either, but I mean, I have to be realistic. I'm just seeing no provisions in consumer law to protect against that. I think our only shot on that in particular is with the European Citizens Initiative. If that passed, we might be able to make the argument that there should be some requirement on the basis of cultural preservation. Because normally that has almost no legal teeth at all. But if it's piggybacking on this other initiative, which has a much stronger consumer basis,
Mhm.
maybe we can get something. But even if we don't, that's not the worst scenario because how many games still do that? I want to say it's like 10 or less. It's mostly this old guard MMOs
Mhm.
that manage to survive that are still doing the subscription model. Again, like, World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy names go way back.
RuneScape,
So,
and there's not many. Yeah, there's not many other like sub MMO, and even RuneScape that has a
yeah,
free to play
because
mode as well.
EVE Online has,
Mm, mm.
and even then it gets a little weird with because they have free versions also, but I
Right.
guess well, that's almost like a gray area inside a gray area.
Mm.
That's not worth getting into. But um, I guess so. It's so few games where I mean, what out of games now that have an online only connection, so that's the only way you can play it. I want to say the subscription ones where you have to buy a subscription. That's got to be like what 1 to 2% of them.
Even
The rest
I
of
doubt it's even that much. It's probably like 0.1
see,
percent.
yeah. So those are acceptable losses.
Mm-hmm.
And for people worrying that, oh, if this passed and everything is going to go subscription only, well, we've already been there with MMOs in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s. Lots of companies were jumping on that bandwagon of like, hey, sign up for our game because they all saw the World of Warcraft money.
Mm-hmm.
But almost all of them ended up either dying or going free to play on a different business model because that just worked out better. So believe me, if companies thought they could get away with charging subscription fees for all their big games, they would. They wouldn't need to have a law to incentivize them on that.
Well, yeah,
So
they've realized because of other very lax laws around child gambling, it's a lot more profitable to have a free to play game. You make a lot more money not charging people money for it.
yeah, and that's the other thing is like again, while I'm not a fan of that,
It's outside
nothing
of the
we're doing.
scope.
Yeah, well, nothing that we're doing would interfere with existing business models, except once they're done.
Right.
Once support ends. So if if they want to run the game exactly as they are now for another 10 years, fine.
Mhm.
That's we're trying to keep the scope as narrow as possible to maximize our odds on this. So.
Mhm. Okay, so when we talk about the kinds of affected games, I think it's important to talk about like what the differences between those are, because you have your live service games and then you have your single player games that have an online connection, and then you have your like sub MMOs which are still live service but you're paying specifically for access. And just so we're like everyone's clear on what we're talking
Sure,
about here.
sure. Again, they're gonna think I'm a radical here, but the thing to remember is you're thinking more as a gamer. You need to think more as a lawmaker,
Hmm.
and the law does not really distinguish between single player, multiplayer, MMOs. I mean, I'd stop and think about it. The only thing I can think of is like when they put the content ratings for
Hmm.
online only games, they say, well, your online interactions are unrated. There's that. There are a lot of laws on privacy and data collection, but that can happen in a single player game too that connects online.
Hmm.
So it's there's not really a legal distinction here. So I'm thinking, well, why make one? I
Mhm.
mean, it's so we're kind of that's why we kind of kept the language a little broad deliberately to give developers and publishers maximum flexibility with how to address this. Like again, in the citizens initiative, we say leave them in a reasonably playable state. Well, by saying it, by wording it that way, we're not insisting 100% of all features work on the end of life build. Like, let's say the game it was like an arena shooter. They give you an end of life build, but now matchmaking and achievements don't work.
Right.
Well, close enough. I think. Whereas if they give you an end of life build and all you can do is just get a login screen, which you can't get past, that's not good enough. And then people would report that to agencies, and then they would probably get fined for that.
Mhm.
So because for the developer, for some their source code is going to be sacred and they don't want to release that to anybody. So they're going to say, okay, we'll just patch the client to be able to accept like private servers and connections, and then we'll call it a day in that, and they can't see what was behind there. Others are thinking, well, we don't want to mess with this anymore. Fine, here's our code and server tools. Have fun trying to run it, and then just shut it down so it's a minimum amount of work. So yeah, the analogy I make is, if you have a stop sign, your
Mhm.
car needs to stop by the stop sign. We're not saying most people are going to use their brakes. Some people, you could use the handbrake. You could do a rolling stop where you coast. We're not dictating that part, just saying stop at that stop sign. Now, for single player MMOs, so under that, by asking for a reasonable working state,
Mhm.
most games are already compliant. If you buy a game and when the studio shuts down and support ends, but you can still run it without having to connect to them, great. You're
Mhm.
already compliant. For ones that require a connection, like for a single player game that requires a connection, let's say for DRM,
Mhm.
well, then they would have to disable the DRM at that point once they shut it down. For, I guess, like smaller scale multiplayer games, like again, arena shooters kind of thing, those I think, to have like a reasonable, like let's say if they're multiplayer focused,
Mhm.
I think you'd have to allow private server support, not support, but functionality on some level
Right.
once they shut it down.
You don't
So
have to
you're no
provide it,
longer,
but you have to allow people to connect to a external IP address.
yeah, exactly, external IP address, and people can host it, kind of like the old school, like lots of deathmatch shooters,
Right.
things like
Go
that.
play Quake or
But
something like that. Yeah.
like the top end of the spectrum will be like an MMO. Let's say it's very ambitious one too,
Mhm.
where there's no way this server can run on just consumer hardware. Well, in that case, they would have to release a build of it where, or just, well, I get to another topic later, but example would be they release a build of it. Let's say it is for some custom, like server shard that, specialized hardware. Fine, good enough. If the players are dedicated enough, they'll find a way to host that, or maybe they'll find some hacks for it to get it working on a x86 machine or something,
Mhm.
and give it that way. As long as they're giving customers a reasonable chance. So if it's not, again, plenty of games, it may not be even possible to run it on what the client was running on.
Mhm.
But in those scenarios, fine, give us some repair tools. And the topic I was going to mention, part of the reason this was actually a debate with the initiative, the official initiative members. I'm
Mhm.
actually not a part of that officially.
Mhm.
I helped organize it, but once it launched, then it's out of my hands. But I'm in touch with them, obviously. But
Mhm.
the they were considering putting a reasonably playable states, or the part we were considering adding was, or the ability to re- a reasonable chance of repairing it. So
Mhm.
in other words, okay, we're not giving you the code, but we are giving you all this documentation on how the network protocols work, and we're decrypting like the packets and stuff like that, so that so that knowledgeable people could have a fighting chance of making an emulator,
Mhm.
maybe within a couple weeks, just if they have all the documentation there, as opposed to years trying to reverse engineer this
Right.
crap.
Right.
Um, but the reason we didn't include that is that's actually a bit of a bargaining chip. It's kind of an open secret where if this if the initiative passes the signature threshold, then it goes to the European Union Commission, and then they'll decide, like, okay, how best to implement this.
Right.
I mean, and they might want to like have some compromises, and that's a perfectly acceptable compromise as long as we have a fighting chance of running the game versus just everything locked down, no documentation, no server software, where it's just I don't even know how the people who get emulators do it.
I
mean,
don't know. Like, there's been RuneScape private servers for years. There's been WoW private servers. There is a very early project. It's been early for many years. Called Project Sapphire for FF14 private servers. I don't know how they do it. It's yeah.
And the thing is, it's usually only the biggest games that
Yeah,
tend
yeah,
to get
yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of treatment too. So
Either the biggest
mid-range
games or the
stuff.
ones that do a lot of stuff client side.
Yeah. So we're really trying to tackle all of it. The weakest
Yeah,
being
yeah.
subscription fee, because there's no consumer law that would say like, oh, this is unreasonable. They're telling you how long it lasts. Now, of course, personally, again, I want any game that people really care about to be possible to be saved personally. But again, we're just going with what can happen.